the first of our brilliant speakers for this session is Gary Tabor, who I'm going to bring in now. Hey, how's it going? How's it going? Oh, I think you're on mute. I'll just unmute you.
Oh. No, I'm on mute. Yeah, sorry. Hi, Eleanor. It's great to see you. I mean, I'm just getting down from the treetops here. It was a great session before. That was wonderful.
It was indeed. Now, before you start talking, I just want to kind of to big you up for a session, for a second. So Gary is brilliant on many accounts. He is the president of the Large Landscapes Project, and he has over 30 years of experience working on large-scale conservation projects. So I'm just so excited to hear what you have to say today. I can't wait. So do you need to share your screen? Should I get that?
Yes, I will share my screen.
Brilliant.
Give me a second here, and I'll start a little talk.
Brilliant.
Not as exciting as talking to a northern white rhino. What can I tell you?
Well, I'm very excited. I think this is going to be a brilliant talk. I saw your and. Not only this, but you also have a Wikipedia page. When I saw that, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm so excited that he's going to be coming to speak today. So
don't believe everything you read on the internet. So anyway, can you see my first slide?
Yes. Can you see that? We can see it. Yes.
All right. That's great. So let me just go, today's talk is more ground level than being in the treetops or visiting with a rhino. So, but bear with me. You'll understand why this is important. Look. More than 50% of the planet now is fragmented. We live in a fragmented space. Nature, no part of the world is not touched by people. In fact, the world is so fragmented, there's less room to roam for wildlife, large mammals all over the world. In fact, they can't even complete their life cycle. There's less space for them. They can't search for shelter, for food, for mates. It's very disturbing. So when we think about species extinction, there is a spatial element to this issue. And at the tip of the spear of fragmentation are roads. And every road that every paved road in the world right now will double in the next 25 to 30 years. And in fact, with post-COVID stimulus packages and infrastructure, road building is going to go in new places and in places that have never seen a road before, many with high biodiversity. And here's the thing that people aren't paying attention to, that with all these new roads in all these new places, now a low estimate is that there are over 100 million large mammals killed in either rail or road collisions every year. And when we think about this fragmentation, we have to think about this as that it's also more fragmentation is more disease. Landscape health is public health. We're totally disrupting the interaction of species. When we talk about 1 million species at risk, we're talking about 1 million species that are not interacting, that are not giving us our soils, fertility, our clean water, clean air, the ecological functions that sustain life on Earth. Our solution to conservation since the 19th century, 1872, the first national park, and I am now speaking to you from 1 hour away from Yellowstone National Park in Montana, is Yellowstone. And if anyone ever bothers to look at the boundary of Yellowstone, you will see it is a box. And if you think like a box for conservation, this is how you will manage nature. And if you think that is kind of goofy, it is. But all over the world, we seem to be managing nature like these patterns of boxes. Now, wildlife, as we know, they don't pay attention to borders. And here are the mapped elk migrations in Yellowstone National Park. And if you look closely, they don't follow or stay inside the box. In fact, most of us have a sense of conservation as a snapshot. Most of the GIS mapping, most of the way we analyze nature is a snapshot in time. But in reality, nature is dynamic, just like the phenology, the seasonal green up of nature every year here in the United States, but all over the world. And this is what we mean, that nature is a fluid, dynamic process, and yet we do not yet have the tools to protect this dynamic element. So here is my kind of thinking to you all, that the national park which is this cornerstone of conservation and needed, is a 19th century concept. We tried to expand that concept in the 20th century with ecosystems. Can we increase the pattern to protect the processes of nature? But now, in a time of climate change, the 21st century, we're in a period of ecological process conservation. And what do I mean? All these things from wildlife behavior, hydrology, migration, dispersal, pollination, trophic dynamics, and even resilience. These are the key functions that we need to protect the biosphere, to protect nature, and to protect ourselves. This all gets to how do we conserve nature outside of protected areas, what's called the matrix. It's not a movie, it's an ecological term for what's called the messy middle between protected areas, where there are multi-stakeholders involved, multi-jurisdictions, a mix of culture. But conservation happens on all lands and waters, not just in protected lands and waters. So think of connectivity conservation as a circulatory system of nature. If protected areas are our organs, the hearts and lungs of nature, the circulatory system that sustains those organs is the connectivity that we need to protect, much of it inside and outside of parks, such as what's going on here right near me in the crown of the continent, the landscape that surrounds Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, the first peace park in the world. So what is connectivity conservation? It is the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural resources that sustains life on Earth. It connects the climate and biodiversity agendas. It is the countermeasure to fragmentation, and it connects all these global initiatives from climate change, restoration, desertification, the migratory species, and the post-2020 biodiversity framework. The rubber hits the road through connecting and reconnecting nature. Why is connectivity important? Because more connected landscapes and seascapes are more effective. Much of us think of this for wildlife migration, but it's not just for animals moving in spaces, it's for the ecological processes like migration across spaces that change nature, especially in a changing climate time. And as we know, the world is changing rapidly. The conditions for life are changing, and we need that room to adapt. And connectivity gives that ability to adapt to these changing environments. It's not just terrestrial, because so many people think of connectivity as a terrestrial element. But in the 3D world of the marine realm, it's equally important. And protecting and connecting marine protected areas is a very key element in our frontier of conservation. And don't forget about our river systems, because freshwater connectivity is equally important. And so many of our rivers around the world are being dammed. And we continue to dam, knowing that this undermines the health of our river systems. Connectivity also is important for our sustainable enterprises, whether it's coastal fisheries, forestry, and agriculture. In fact, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development 3 years ago penned a report, a call to action to save connectivity, because it is not being a priority within global conservation efforts. But that's changing. We did a survey of 30 years of connectivity conservation planning. And since 2000, it's been an exponential growth of applying the science of connectivity conservation into action. And much of it being in North America, but the inflection of the rate of uptake is equal on all continents around the world, just with a lag. And just last week, the United Nations General Assembly approved, or a unanimous approval or adoption of a resolution on connectivity called Nature Knows No Border, that we have to pay more attention to connecting conservation. And it's enshrined in the current Aichi Target 11, because so many people focus on the 17% of nature being protected or the 10% of marine areas, which is not enough, and that these systems have to be well connected, has to be improved. Connectivity is now being enshrined in national policy from Bhutan to Costa Rica, Kenya, Tanzania, and even Canada now is considering various national policies relating to connectivity. Even in the last US federal administration, and now in the current administration, twice in the House of Representatives, we've had a bill passed for a National Wildlife Corridor Act, and we believe this will happen in this Congress. And 17 US states in the last 3 years have adopted policies to support wildlife corridors. And in fact, we even have a new designation of a designated wildlife corridor in Wyoming, connecting the winter and summer ranges outside of Grand Teton National Park for the pronghorn antelope. So as we think about saving more of the planet for nature, because what we have now is not enough, and some of us say that you have to get to 50% of the planet protected to be nature friendly to save life on this earth. And a lot of it, we're doing this in getting to 50% is through what's called the 30 by 30 or 30% by the year 2030, is that we want to increase the amount of protection of land and water protected areas to 30%. Currently, it's about 15.4%, and only 10% of these lands are connected. But here we've mapped the current protected areas on a blue ocean background. And yes, we can increase their size, but if we don't connect them, we have a problem because they won't be as effective. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to essentially have countries around the world, as they protect more, connect more. And that would be on this middle dotted line in this graph. So it's a blending of connecting more of the conservation estate with more connectivity over time. Why is this important? Because in a fragmented world, connections or connected networks of protected areas are essentially the architecture for large landscape conservation. It's happening in Africa along the Albertine Rift, in North America in Yellowstone to Yukon, and in Eastern Australia, the Great Eastern Ranges. Connecting protected areas are more effective protected areas. My nighttime job is chair of IUCN's Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group, and we have 1,000 members in 125 countries. And what we're trying to do is educate folks and governments around the world why connectivity is such a vital issue for conservation. This year, we released for the first time the global guidance for how do you conserve ecological networks and ecological corridors. What we need now in this realm of exponential growth of a new conservation practice is consistent and measurable practice so we can improve what we do and learn from what we do. Just in English, there are all these terms relating to connectivity conservation: linkage zones, biological corridors, climate corridors, areas of connectivity conservation, wildlife corridors, you name it. They're all over the place. We have to figure out some system for consistent practice in all languages. And what we're trying to do is we've come up with a new designation called an ecological corridor, which complements protected areas and these new type of protected areas called OECMs, other effective conservation measures, or otherwise known as conserved areas. And if you put these three legs of the stool together, you get ecological networks. And this is a conceptual representation of what an ecological network could look like across all realms: land and sea, coastal, and freshwater. And what we're trying to do in a fragmented world is reconnect that world so we have functional nature. Of course, we talked about roads earlier, and where we have lost connection, where we cannot protect connection or restore connection, we can also create crossing structures around roads. So here's a shout out to all the folks who think green infrastructure is also the greening of roads. And we need, as we build roads, we need to include this kind of crossing structures to mitigate the impacts of roads as fragmenting forces in nature. But connectivity is also an element of social connectivity. If done well, you also connect people of different cultures, of different abilities and stakeholder groups and rights groups across landscapes. And I just want to give you one example here. Then in Waterton Glacier International Peace Park area, and the ecosystem is known as the crown of the continent, it's an area that's going to lose all its glaciers in the next 30 years. All these interest groups, 5 tribes, the industry, the government, the conservation community, the local people, all look to this landscape for water. They're all connected to the landscape, but not to each other. So what we've been trying to do for the last 15 years is take those interests, connect the people who are connected to the landscape, and create a roundtable. And this is how connectivity conservation is going to work. You have to bring people together to connect nature, to connect people. And it's not just here. When we looked across the United States, there were over 430 large landscape efforts that are doing this. And that gives me hope, because if you can start connecting these landscape initiatives, you can start to weave together nature from the bottom up. And so we've been trying to map all these large landscape efforts and seascape efforts around the world. There are hundreds of them. And our goal is that we can save the planet. There won't be a top-down approach here, but we can do so by connecting all these interconnected, bottom-up, large landscapes and seascapes at a time. I'd like to show you one minute video at the end here to kind of bring home the point of why connectivity is important.
Oh my goodness. What a brilliant talk. That was absolutely fascinating and totally inspirational. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And the clips at the end are just absolutely gorgeous. So I'm sure there'll be a couple of questions coming in. But while waiting for that, I had a few questions of my own. So first of all, like, I'm sure after watching that, there will be young conservationists who are like, yeah, this is a really big area. Like, I want to get involved in that. What advice would you give to young conservationists, kind of PhD level or kind of younger, if they wanted to kind of engage with this as a problem? What would you recommend?
Engage with people. Science is only going to take us so far. So much of what I'm dealing with as a person who came into this from the animal and science side of things is that working with people from all cultures who are in the landscapes are key to making a difference. Truly get out of our shells. If you're an introvert, you're going to have to become a little bit extroverted to essentially address these issues. Your ideas matter, your energy matters, and getting out into the landscapes, like we just saw in Osa Peninsula, was a fantastic way of how we deal with conservation. Now, it is, the other element that I like to say, and there's a real gap here. When I talked about the road issue and road ecology, there are not a lot of people working on this. If you have an interest to mitigate this really global problem, because transportation growth is tremendous, we need people trained in this. While there may be a lot of people who may want to study tigers and elephants and rhinos, we have few who want to study the roads and how they impact those species.
And you mentioned, as part of this, you mentioned this amazing goal by 30% of connectivity by 2030. Do you think we're going to hit that goal? And if so, how do you think this is going to come about?
Well, I always remind people, the COVID did set us back, but it also was a learning point, because it really is 8.5 years by 2030. Look, the ultimate goal is to have somewhere between 50% of the planet nature friendly by 2050. So the 30% by 2030 was an incremental step. We can't do it overnight. And of course, 2030 is 8.5 years away, and we probably won't meet that. It's very challenging, which is why we need new innovations in conservation protection. The national park concept will only get us so far. A lot of the growth in conservation will be working with indigenous peoples all around the world. They own most or control most of these key critical landscapes. It's their landscapes, and working with indigenous people are critical to achieving that target and honoring the legacy and their sovereignty in these landscapes. Where we have this mixed use, fragmented landscapes, voluntary or incentive-based conservation is critical. I mean, the growth of conservation easements and covenants working with private landowners around the world has been a boon for conservation. And I believe that's the future. You looked at Old Pejeta earlier today. Conservancies in Kenya are the future of conservation in Kenya. While Kenyan national parks are one of the standards in the world, these new conservancies that they've created will probably be a model for how do you protect lands outside of protected areas. That's the future, because as I said before, conservation happens on all lands and seas. You just can't wall off nature, and you can't wall off those ecological processes. And that's why we have to have a more comprehensive approach and comprehensive thinking with regards to saving nature.
Yeah, definitely. And what's your view? This is absolutely kind of fascinating. With regard to like kind of in conservation, there's often kind of budgetary constraints and that kind of thing. And a lot of the projects that you're talking about are very international. How do you think would be a good way of kind of ensuring those resources can kind of cross international boundaries and that kind of thing? What's your views on the kind of financing side of things?
Well, first of all, the UN has put a number around $90 trillion will be part of the Build Back Better post-COVID economic stimulus, $90 trillion. There was a talk earlier in the Global Biodiversity Festival that we needed $500 billion a year. That is just a fraction of $90 trillion, first of all. That money has to be spent in high biodiversity places around the world to save nature, or places that have mostly intact landscapes. I think we have not been ambitious in our targets for nature, and we have not been ambitious in our budgets for nature. If anything, if you could capture the loss of livelihoods from the COVID-19 situation, which was an emergent disease derived from fragmenting of landscapes, of disruption of ecology and biodiversity. If you know that trillion-dollar figure, multi-trillion-dollar figure, and you're not thinking about how do we prevent the next pandemic or prevent any kind of undermining of the environmental base that supports livelihood, then you're going to be paying much more. It's much more expensive to do nothing. It is. And you think you're saving money, but that's an illusion. So we have to be much more expansive and ambitious in the budgets that we have to think about for saving nature. And there is something called the High Ambition Coalition. There are like 50 countries who've signed up to think bigger about nature, not because nature is an abstract. It's because nature directly affects our livelihoods and our public health. And the more we, and a festival like this drives home that point, that biodiversity conservation is conserving us as much as it is conserving biodiversity.
Wow. I feel inspired. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about this like really impressive and really important issue. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing. It's awesome. I can't wait to continue reading about this awesome work.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much. All right.